Hi everyone. The theme of this video is checks, captures, and threats. So when you play a game of chess and you're playing a serious game with a longer time control, then every time it's your move, you have to consider every check that you can make in the position, every capture you can make, and every threat you can make, like threatening a piece or a square or a tactic or something like that. You also have to consider your opponent's checks, captures, and threats in response. All right, so to illustrate what I mean by this, we're going to solve some puzzles here on Lichess, and we're going to try to solve them all by looking at checks, captures, and threats. So here it's black to move, and there's some obvious checks in the position. There is rook to h1 check. There's also queen to e3 check. So those are possibilities we have to consider. I don't really see any captures worth looking into. That's defended. That's defended. No other captures. I don't see a good way to threaten a piece. His rooks are defending each other. I don't see a good way to threaten his queen. He does have an advanced passed pawn here, threatening to win my rook by queening and making me take the queen and winning the rook. Okay, but I'm going to go with those two checks. Which one is correct? Rook to h1 check or queen to e3 check? Well, if I play queen to e3 check, then he can block the check with rook to f2. Is there a follow-up? My rook on h4 would be loose, be undefended. I don't see a follow-up, so let's look at the other check. Rook to h1 check flushes the king out to f2. Is there a follow-up? Well, now with the king on f2, there's a new check. There's queen to d2 check. And in fact, that's a checkmate. There's no way to take my queen, block the check, and there's no safe square for the king to move. So it's a mate in two. So we found that by looking at the different checks in the position. Let's try another puzzle. Okay, so again, black to move. Let's consider checks, captures, and threats. Let's start with the checks. So there are a few checks here. There is bishop to g2 check, and there are some checks with the queen, like queen takes rook, queen takes pawn, queen to g2, and queen to f3. So out of all of those checks, we'll see if any of them work before we move on to captures and threats. We'll start with the checks. Okay, some of the queen checks look suicidal. You don't want to lose your queen unless you see a follow-up. The bishop check can run into rook takes bishop attacking our queen, and I don't see a follow-up. So the only other check here is queen to f3. And the king is trapped. It has nowhere to run, so the only move is to block the check with rook to g2. But then we can take the rook with the queen, and that would be a mate. So again, we found the solution to the puzzle simply by considering all the checks, captures, and threats. Let's try another puzzle. Okay, so here we're white. And this time I don't see any checks. I don't see any way to check the black king. So moving on from checks to captures, do we have any captures? Yes, we have a possibility of capturing the knight here. Are there any other captures? I don't think so. So the question is this the correct move? Capturing the knight. Don't we just get a free knight here? Well, the queen on e3 would be open, but it's defended. If he takes our queen, we take back. Okay, so what's the material count? So presently, black is up a pawn. So if I take the knight and he maybe captures back with the queen, he can't even capture back because we have a bishop here defending as well. He can't capture back with the pawn because we get a free queen then. And he doesn't want to capture back with the queen or the rook because he'll lose it to our bishop. So it looks like we're getting a knight and we're not even having to lose a pawn unless he takes our queen and we recapture. Yeah, and then he can take our pawn. So yeah, that's something he can do. So it looks like we can take a knight for a pawn. 2-point swing in our advantage. We can do that. I don't see any other captures. So moving on to threats. Are there any threatening moves we can make? I don't really see any way to attack his queen without using our queen. If we attack his queen with our queen, then he can always trade queens. His rooks are protected. His knight is already under attack. So I don't see any attacking moves. So running through all the checks, captures, and threats, I'm going to capture the knight, and that was correct. I'm going to recapture, and that's it. Let's move on to another puzzle. Okay, so all checks, captures, and threats. Let's begin with the checks. So we have a check with the knight. Doesn't look great. You can take with the pawn. Block up the g-file. We have 2 checks with the queen here and here. G7 and G8. Let's look at each one. So if I play queen to G7 check, he's forced to take with the bishop since the rook is defending our queen. And I don't see a follow-up after that. If I take the bishop with the rook, he can take the rook with his king. So that doesn't look so good. So look at the other check. Queen to G8 check. That forces him to take back with the rook. We have a knight covering that square and a rook covering that square. So what's our follow-up? Another check. So looking down this path, we find the other check. Rook takes rook. And that's not only a check, it's a mate. So yes, queen to G8 check here leads to a mate in 2. He takes, we take back, and that rook is supported by our knight. Okay, so moving on, another puzzle. Start with the checks. So I only see 1 check in the position. How do you find checks, and how do you find them quickly? Well, it takes experience, but you look at each one of your pieces and you visualize the different lines of motion. So you look at the knight and you visualize the different places it can move to. This knight is too far away to check. This knight is too far away to check. These rooks are blocked by a lot of pieces. They can't check. The bishop is on a dark square. It can't check a light square. So that leaves the queen, and the only line of motion that makes any sense is forward here on this file, and there's the only check in the position. So does it accomplish anything? Well, it does because it simultaneously attacks the bishop. So he can move the king, which he would have to do either to f8 or h8, and then we can take his bishop. So it's a fork. And since material is currently equal, winning a bishop is good, and I don't see a follow-up. He doesn't really have any checks, captures, or threats in return. Any threats that we can't parry, that is. So we'll go for that. So we're going to continue to solve puzzles by checks, captures, and threats. Okay, so here, there's not a lot of pieces on the board. There's no way to check the black king. So let's move on from checks to captures. Are there any captures? No. So that leaves threats. Can we threaten something? Well, there's something trivial we can threaten. We can push the pawn here and threaten that pawn, but that pawn's already defended, and not to mention he can take our pawn. So no, I don't see any like piece threats, but there are indirect threats in chess. I would like to queen that pawn, but it's defended by the bishop. Can we threaten to queen the pawn? Is there a threat to queen the pawn, a move we can make to threaten to queen the pawn? There is. We can play f3, blocking the bishop's access to that square. That move is considered a threat because we're threatening to queen the pawn. And I think it's an unstoppable threat. He has no checks in return, no captures in return, other than queen takes pawn and king takes bishop, and then we queen next or soon after a possible check and getting out of check. So there's no way to meet that threat, so we're going to play it. That's a threat. Okay, and he delays matters by checking us. I guess we do have to be careful here because if I move away, he can take the pawn and then he's on that queening square again. So we should have considered that. That's a checking response that we should consider to our threat. We threatened, he checked, and we should have been ready for that. Luckily we are. We play here and defend the pawn. So now we're going to queen, and there's no stopping it. Okay, so next puzzle. Can we solve this by checks, captures, and threats? Okay, start with checks. We cannot check with any of our pawns, so that leaves our queen. There are a couple silly checks here, and he just wins our queen. I don't see a follow-up. So we can check along this rank here. We can play either queen here or queen here. Those are both checks. He can run with the king. Is there a follow-up? Let's consider one at a time. Queen to b2 check. Let's say he runs the king over here to safety. Is there a follow-up? I don't see any good captures or checks or threats after that. We can do things like threaten the rook. He can move it away. We can chase his pieces around the board. He can move it here to safety. The pawn would be protecting it and the rook would be protecting the knight. So it doesn't look promising to play this move. So we move on to the other check, and that's the one that works because not only is it a check, but it also threatens the rook. And so that's a fork. So how does he get out of that? Or does he get out of that? Well, if he moves the king, we take the rook. We win a whole rook, and then we have a good endgame there, I think. Queen versus the rook and knight should be pretty good with these pawns on the board. Not to mention we'll be threatening the knight here and possibly the pawn, depending on where he moves the king. So it looks like a pretty good ending. If he doesn't move the king, he can block the check with the rook, but we can take the rook anyway and call check and win another pawn. So yeah, that looks good. I see nothing else. We're going to play it. Check wins, and then a capture wins. So check and capture. Let's try another puzzle. Okay, we'll start with the checks. There are several checks here. There are queen checks. There's some silly queen checks like here or here. He just takes the queen and we cry. There's nothing to do there. We go here and check. He moves the king away somewhere. I don't see a follow-up. We move here and check, same thing. We move here and check and we lose our queen. I don't see any productive checks with the queen, but there are other checks in the position. Besides moving the queen, I can see 6 other ways to check the king that do not involve this queen. Can you see 6 checks? Okay, I hope you noticed this rook is in line with that king, and if the knight moves, it's check. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 checks. 6 moves here that check the king. Let's cut to the chase. Which one is best? Well, when you have a discovered check, you would like to threaten something at the same time. So can we check and threaten all in one move? If you can do 2 of those 3 things, check, capture, and threat, that would be great. And I see one. Knight here threatens the queen. So I think that's the move. Is it winning? So if we call check by moving knight to c5, he can maybe block the check here, but we can take it with the knight, and he can win the knight for the queen. We're down a piece right now, so if we can get the queen for our knight, then we would be up material. That would be good. If he moves the king, we just take the we take the queen anyway. If he, yeah, nothing else to do. So that's got to be it. Okay, we check, we take the queen. Okay, let's try another one. Okay, start with the checks. So I see 3 checks. Do you see 3 checks? Okay, I see 1 check with the queen. I see pawn to e8, queen equals queen, that's a check, or equals rook, that's a check. Okay, so 3 checks. All right, what's the winning one? Let's look at them one at a time, if one of them wins. If they don't, we move on to the captures. So queen to f8 check. So his king is trapped, so he has to capture. But then we can recapture and promote to either a rook or a queen and its mate. So we don't have to look any further. If we find a forced mate, and we play it. And we're going to play a rook for fun. And that's the win. Okay, let's try another puzzle. Okay, checks, captures, threats. I don't see any checks this time. I only have pawns. I cannot check with any of my pawns. They're too far back. So what about captures? Are there any captures? I can't capture anything with my king. That's defended. I have no pawn captures. So no captures. Are there any threats? Okay, well, I cannot threaten his knight. I can move over here and threaten this pawn. That seems a little that doesn't seem very sensible because it's wasting a lot of time while his knight is collecting up our pawns here. So I don't want to attack that pawn. I can't attack the knight. Nothing else I can attack that's not already defended. So I think the threat we should make is to queen a pawn. And which of our pawns is the best candidate to queen? Well, the pawn that is on an unopposed file, of course. This one has no black pawns in front of it. That is our candidate. What if we pushed it? How does he stop us from queening? If he takes, we take back. Can his knight get back in a hurry to stop that pawn? It's only 2 squares away. I don't think so. This king is well placed to block this knight out. So if he takes and we take back, can his king stop? Well, if it wants to stop, it better come over in a hurry, maybe here. Then we can move the king up to support the pawn, and we're going to get a check, tempo. So even if he tries to rush back with the knight, we've got that extra tempo on his king. So I don't think taking is possible. We take back and we still threaten to queen a pawn. So can he do anything besides take? Well, if he moves his king over, then what do we do? That looks good, because then if we call check, he can get right in front of the pawn, and there's nothing I can do. So what do we do if he moves the king over? Okay, if I take, so let's see, move the pawn here, moves the king over, take, take. Doesn't look good. Okay, what can I do if he moves the king over? Can I move up? Yeah, he can take my pawn, but then I recapture and I have a new pawn there. I'm going to have to move up if he moves his king over, and we're back to a similar position. Okay, if this were a timed puzzle, we would have played this move a long time ago, since it's the only one that seems to make any sense in the position, and I think we have it. We are going to queen a pawn with the aid of our king. If he takes, we take back. If he moves over, we go up and threaten to push it with tempo, forcing him to take. We take back, and we're threatening to push with tempo anyway. So this is the winning move. He took, we take back, and it stops there. But I'm going to put the analysis on, and it says his best move is this, and then our best response is this, and he just runs away. But he can try to stop us, but we move up. Yeah, there's nothing he can do. Let's try another puzzle. Okay, so we are black. Checks, captures, threats. Let's talk about checks. So I can't check with the bishop. It's on the wrong colored square. I can't check with any of my pawns, so that leaves the knight, and there are 2 checks. One of them is going to get captured. I don't like that. This check looks really good. That pawn is defended, and we have to hurry because he's threatening to take that pawn. This is a nice forcing move. The king has to move somewhere, either here or here, and then we queen the pawn, defended by our knight. So this is a check, and it wins. Okay, he moves the king, and we queen, and we don't even care if he wins our knight. We are going to win material back, and that is it. Okay, let's try another one. Let's make this the last puzzle. Okay, checks, captures, and threats. So checks, are there any checks in the position? I cannot check with the bishop, it's the wrong colored square. The rook is too far away to check. None of the pawns can check. The queen cannot check, so it's up to this knight. And the knight can check in various ways. It can directly check the king, or it can move anywhere because the queen would end up checking. Now, if we move it here or here or here, that gives us a discovered check by the queen, but he can answer that by taking the queen. Besides, what's the material count here? Bishop, knight, rook, queen each, 3 pawns each. It's even. So we can't just drop our queen. So the only sensible check is this, and that is called a double check because 2 pieces would be checking the white king. And double checks are great because the only way to get out of a double check is to move your king. You cannot block both checks. You cannot capture both pieces. You have to move your king. So where is he going to move his king if we play knight here? Well, that square's covered. These squares are covered. So he has to move to one of these 3 on the back rank. Let's say he moves here. Then this is a check and a mate, defended by the knight. And if he moves there, it's also a check and a mate. And if he moves there, it's also a check and a mate, thanks to the queen blocking his exit. So it looks like a forced mate in 2, thanks to the double check. And then we mate. Okay, you can solve virtually any puzzle with this idea of checks, captures, and threats, and you can apply it to your actual games as well. All right, thanks for watching the video.